I'm afraid the fog of war thickens over Ukraine and Russia's territorial ambitions remain undeterred, and this has led to murmurs of conscription resurfacing across Europe and even in Britain. And the question now lingers, are we as a nation truly prepared for what may lie ahead? Because the recent developments have intensified this discussion. Vladimir Putin, ever the opportunist, has not only dodged recent calls for a ceasefire, but has exploited the intelligence sharing pause implemented or thudded into action by Trump's stupidity to advance his forces through the Kursk Oblast. And Putin's army, battered yet resolute, has reconfigured itself into a war machine sustained by a semi-permanent wartime economy, outspending all of Europe's military budgets combined on a purchasing power parity basis. And the West, meanwhile, dithers, debates, and some argue it deludes itself into thinking that voluntary recruitment will suffice in the face of Russian aggression. And the notion of conscription has sent ripples through the political universe. The former Defence Secretary, Lord Hammond, has issued stark warnings that young men in Britain are woefully unprepared to defend their country. His call for a radical shift in social mentality, urging Britain to cut spending on welfare and rearm its defence industry, has drawn both alarm and intrigue. The spectre of a major conflict, particularly if the United States under Trump reduces its European commitments and forces the UK and NATO allies to confront an uncomfortable reality. Europe's defences are inadequate, and if Trump behaves to Europe as it behaved to Ukraine and acts with such a knee-jerk and such a sudden and a negative way, then Europe needs to be seriously ready, and so do we. Michel Dewberry, speaking on GB News, echoed the unease felt by many, stating that the very idea of conscription sends chills down her spine. But the prospect of young Britons being compelled to fight in a war that to some seems distant and abstract has sparked backlash from commentators who believe that professional armies, not hastily assembled conscripts, are the key to modern warfare. That's if it remains over there. Military analysts argue that the UK's current force of 70,000 soldiers, the smallest since the Napoleonic Wars, is wholly insufficient for any large-scale European conflict. Sir Richard Sheriff, the former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, has warned that Britain must prepare for selective conscription or risk strategic irrelevance. And the argument from a purely military standpoint is difficult to ignore. Countries like Sweden and Latvia have already reintroduced national service, recognising that voluntary enlistment alone is insufficient to counter this existential threat. Of course, conscription is not without its practical and philosophical challenge. As Peter Hitchens aptly put it, every serious person in the military knows that conscription does enormous damage to professional armed forces. The dilution of military experience, the logistics of training thousands of reluctant recruits, and the question of social resistance all pose formidable obstacles. But would the British public largely disengage from military matters, accept a government decree to force their sons, and indeed their daughters, into uniform? The answer at present seems to be an emphatic no, but that may change. And it may have to change sooner rather than later. A lot depends not so much on what Putin does, but on what Trump does. We are caught in this pincer move of two irrational individuals, one of whom is dead and the other one is, well, approaching the grave rapidly. And further complicating matters is the broader global context. The war in Ukraine has exposed the West's over-reliance on American military support. European leaders, including Keir Starmer, have called for greater defence spending to compensate for Washington's potential retreat from NATO obligations. But Britain's economic constraints make this a tall order. Lord Hammond has controversially suggested that Britain's defence budget could be significantly increased by cutting welfare spending, a move that would spark a political firestorm. And even if conscription were introduced, there's a question of strategy. Would Britain, like Sweden, opt for a selective draft, compelling only a fraction of its youth into military service, or would it embrace a national model seen, for example, in the Cold War era? The logistics of either option are daunting. The moral argument against conscription is equally significant. Many believe that forcing individuals into combat violates the principles of a free society. The concept of a citizen soldier may have been a staple of past conflicts, but in a modern democracy, the notion of state-mandated military service seems increasingly anachronistic. So where does this leave us? At present, the UK government has categorically denied any plans for conscription. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Pat McFadden, has insisted it's not on the table. Yet history teaches us that today's impossibility can swiftly become tomorrow's necessity. Lord Kitchener, when he was appointed to take control of the army in 1914, said it would take 3 years with conscription to bring the army to a suitable force to be able to defeat Germany. So while the newspapers were saying it's all going to be over by Christmas, he was saying, no, 2017 is the earliest, because we were unprepared at the point when the war was called. We were also unprepared in 1939. If Putin escalates this war, if NATO falters, if European security collapses under the weight of Russian aggression, Britain will have to reconsider its position. And the question is not merely whether conscription is desirable, but whether it will, in the end, be unavoidable.